So in this video, I want to go over a recent leak that's been getting a lot of attention. Not necessarily because of what it actually claims, but because of how people reacted to a single line without really looking at the full context. What I'm going to do here is walk through what the leak actually says, connect it with information we already have from earlier sources, and explain why this points more toward long-term planning rather than any sudden change or reset. We'll talk about the characters mentioned, how they line up with different versions, and then I'll explain what people really mean when they say, Genshin 2, because that phrase caused most of the confusion. By the end of this video, you should have a clear picture of what's actually being discussed, why reliable sources stepped in to clarify things, and how all of this fits into Genshin Impact's ongoing story structure. Before going further, it's important to be clear about one thing. Everything discussed here is still subject to change. Nothing is final until it's officially released. That said, the source behind this leak has a strong history of being accurate. This isn't random speculation. In the past, information from this source has lined up closely with what eventually made it into the game. That doesn't mean every detail is guaranteed, but it does mean the overall direction is usually trustworthy. With that out of the way, let's start where the leak begins. According to the information, version 6.5 introduces a character named Lana. She's described as a natural historian, and her gameplay is tied to Lunar Crystallize. What's important here is what the leak doesn't say. It doesn't claim Lunar Crystallize is a new element. It doesn't suggest any major system overhaul. And it doesn't explain new mechanics in detail. Instead, it treats Lunar Crystallize as an existing concept that certain characters are designed around. That detail alone shaped much of the early discussion. A lot of players focused on the fact that Lunar Crystallize is already quite strong, which led to questions about timing rather than balance. Some people wondered why another character would be added to that space so soon, while others felt it showed that this mechanic is meant to be supported long-term. What stood out is that most of the discussion wasn't about numbers or damage values. It was about direction, about whether this feels intentional and planned out. And overall, it does appear to be part of a larger design path rather than a sudden decision. From there, the leak moves on to version 6.7, which is where reactions became much stronger. In version 6.7, the focus shifts to Sandrone. She's described as either electro or cryo, with her kit built around superconduct. The wording here is important. It doesn't say superconduct is being reworked. It doesn't say the reaction is being buffed globally. It only says that Sandrone herself is designed around it. Despite that, the response was intense. For many players, superconduct is associated with early game mechanics, so seeing it tied to a major character raised concerns. Some worried it would limit her usefulness. Others questioned how she would fit into modern team compositions. At the same time, there were players who welcomed the idea. Superconduct has never really had a character built specifically to support it, so this could finally give it a clearer identity. The leak also repeats a story detail that's appeared before, that Sandrone was created by Lana and possesses her own independent will. This part is important because it shows consistency. When the same story elements appear across multiple leaks, it usually means the narrative direction is stable and hasn't changed behind the scenes. Another detail worth noting is how Sandrone is positioned relative to Lana. The leak doesn't say they directly work together, but placing them in nearby versions and tying them to related mechanics follows a pattern Hoyoverse has used many times before. Characters with connected themes often release across consecutive patches instead of all at once. The same section briefly mentions a moon-related map. There's no description, no scale, and no suggestion that it replaces Teyvat. It's simply listed as a location tied to that point in the timeline. That's consistent with how map-related information usually appears early, long before full details are revealed. After that, the leak moves beyond version 7.0 and references the full release of Mare Javari. This isn't a new name. It's something that's existed in lore and older leaks for a long time. Placing it later in the timeline actually makes sense and supports the idea that this has been planned for a while. Up to this point, everything follows a familiar pattern. Characters are tied to existing mechanics. Story elements line up with earlier information. Locations that have been hinted at for years slowly move closer to release. Nothing here suggests a reset or a replacement of the game. That's why the final part of the leak caused so much confusion. According to the source, after the Snezhnaya chapter concludes, something referred to as Genshin 2 inches begins. That phrase alone caused a strong reaction. Many players assumed it meant a sequel, a new game, or even an end-of-service situation. Not long after, clarification came from trusted sources explaining that this does not mean a new game or a reboot. It's simply a way of describing the next major phase of the story within the same game. Once that explanation spread, the reaction changed. People still didn't love the wording, but the fear of losing progress or starting over largely disappeared. And when you look at how Hoyoverse has handled story transitions before, this kind of labeling isn't unusual. In the end, the reaction came down to wording more than content. The leak itself follows a very normal structure. The phrase just created confusion before proper context was added. So when you step back and look at everything together, the picture becomes clearer. Version 6.5 introduces Lana and continues the Lunar Crystallize theme. Version 6.7 brings Sandrone and expands on Superconduct. Later updates move toward Mare Javari. And after Snezhnaya, the story transitions into a new chapter rather than ending. Nothing here suggests a reset. Nothing points to a sequel replacing the game. What it does show is long-term planning and a story that's preparing to move forward in a bigger way. I'm curious what you think about this direction. Do you like the idea of mechanics being expanded across multiple characters over time? And how do you feel about the story moving into a new phase instead of starting over? If you want more breakdowns like this, focused on context instead of panic, make sure to stick around. I'll keep covering these updates as more information becomes available and things become clearer.